After inheriting an empty lake house, Rachel believed she'd finally reached the end of a lifetime of unanswered questions. The house was silent. No family waited inside. No welcome home. Just an old dock stretching across the still water. As she turned to leave, one loose dockboard caught her eye. She almost ignored it. But lifting that single piece of weathered wood uncovered something that had been hidden for decades. Something that would reveal the truth about her family. Change everything she believed about her past. And give her a future she never imagined. Stay with this story until the very end. Because the truth hidden beneath that dock is only the beginning. The real story is how one forgotten discovery transforms a lifetime of loss into a legacy of hope. Every Monday morning, Rachel Holloway walked to the same little post office tucked beside an old hardware store on the edge of a small Wisconsin town. She never hurried. There was no one waiting for her. No one expecting her. Still, she unlocked mailbox number 118 with the same worn brass key she had carried for years. Most Mondays, there was nothing inside. Sometimes a grocery flyer. Sometimes a coupon addressed to current resident. Usually, just silence. The woman behind the counter had watched Rachel come and go for nearly 4 years. She never asked questions anymore. Instead, she simply smiled each Monday and quietly said, "Morning, Rachel." Rachel always smiled back. "Morning." Neither of them mentioned the empty mailbox. Some things become too familiar to explain. The mailbox had been opened for Rachel by a social worker the week she aged out of foster care. She'd been told that if anyone from her family ever tried to find her, this would be the safest place for a letter to arrive. No one ever did. Even so, Rachel never stopped checking. Hope has a strange way of surviving long after reason tells it to disappear. By 23, Rachel had become an expert at living unnoticed. She knew which grocery stores left their parking lot lights on all night, making it just a little less frightening to sleep alone in her old cargo van. She knew which public library restroom opened earliest, where she could wash her face before job interviews. She knew how to fold her blanket neatly every morning, even though no one would ever see it. Dignity, she had learned, wasn't something other people gave you. Sometimes it was the quiet promise you made to yourself. Rachel remembered almost nothing about her parents. No bedtime stories. No birthday parties. No voices she could still recognize. Only one photograph had survived her childhood. Its edges had been scorched in an old apartment fire years before, leaving part of the picture forever missing. She kept it tucked inside the front pocket of her backpack, wrapped carefully in a plastic sleeve. Whenever life became too heavy, she took it out and studied the faces. A young woman holding a little girl. An older man standing beside them, his weathered hand resting gently across both of their shoulders. Rachel had spent years wondering who he was. Sometimes she imagined he had searched for her. Other times, she convinced herself that he probably hadn't. After all, people don't spend decades looking for someone they've forgotten. Or so she believed. The night before everything changed had been bitterly cold. A police officer knocked softly on the window of Rachel's van just before dawn. "I'm sorry," he said kindly. "Store policy. You'll have to move." Rachel nodded before he even finished. She never argued anymore. She simply started the engine, drove across town, and waited for the post office to unlock its doors. Just another Monday. Or so she thought. The woman behind the counter looked up as Rachel walked in. Then she glanced toward mailbox 118. For the first time in years, her smile faded into quiet surprise. "Honey," she whispered, "I think you finally got one." Rachel felt her heartbeat quicken before she reached the little brass door. Inside rested a single cream-colored envelope. No stamp, no return address. Just 2 words written in careful, trembling handwriting. Rachel Holloway. Her fingers shook as she lifted it out. Inside was an old brass key, a faded photograph, and one handwritten note. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. The house on Lake Willow has always been yours." Rachel unfolded the photograph. The older man smiling back at her was the same man from the burned picture she had carried for nearly her entire life. For 23 years, Rachel believed no one knew where she was. She was wrong. Someone had been looking for her all along. Rachel read the letter 3 more times before she finally folded it and slipped it back into the envelope. She wasn't crying. Not yet. The words felt too impossible to believe. For years, she had imagined what it might be like to receive a letter from someone who remembered her. In those daydreams, there were always explanations, long conversations, questions that had waited a lifetime to be asked. Instead, she held only a brass key, a faded photograph, and a sentence that refused to leave her mind. "The house on Lake Willow has always been yours." The woman behind the post office counter quietly walked over. "I've never seen your mailbox hold anything except advertisements," she said softly. Rachel managed a nervous smile. "I was beginning to think it never would." The older woman looked at the envelope for a long moment. "Sometimes," she whispered, "the longest journeys belong to letters that were always meant to arrive." Rachel thanked her, tucked the envelope safely into her backpack, and stepped outside into the cold January air. The wind cut across the empty parking lot, but she hardly noticed. For the first time in years, she wasn't wondering where she would sleep that night. She was wondering where Lake Willow was. The address led her nearly 3 hours north. The farther she drove, the smaller the towns became. Traffic lights disappeared. Gas stations grew farther apart. Snow covered the fields like a quiet blanket, interrupted only by weathered barns and rows of pine trees that stretched toward a pale winter sky. Her old van rattled with every mile. Twice she wondered if it would break down before she arrived. A dozen times she nearly turned around. What if this was some cruel mistake? What if someone had confused her with another Rachel Holloway? Or worse. What if she arrived only to learn the letter had been meant for someone else? Hope could be dangerous. Rachel had learned that lesson long ago. Still, her hand stayed steady on the steering wheel. She kept driving. A wooden sign finally appeared beside the highway. Lake Willow, population 1,842. Rachel slowed the van. The town looked almost frozen in another time. A small diner with steam rising from its windows. An old church whose bell tower overlooked the lake. A bait shop. A grocery store. Children bundled in heavy coats laughing as they pulled sleds across a snowy hill. For a strange moment, Rachel felt like she was looking through someone else's memories. She couldn't explain why. Nothing seemed familiar. Yet nothing felt completely unfamiliar either. The address led her to a narrow road lined with towering pines. Branches bent beneath fresh snow. The lake appeared through the trees first. Still, gray, endless. Then she saw the house. It stood alone near the shoreline, weathered by decades of harsh winters. Its white paint had faded almost to gray. Several porch boards had warped with age. One shutter hung crooked beside an upstairs window. The dock behind the house stretched into the lake like an old hand reaching for something it could no longer touch. Rachel turned off the engine. Silence settled around her. No traffic. No voices. Only the distant cry of a loon somewhere across the frozen water. She remained inside the van for nearly 5 minutes. She had imagined owning a home before. Usually it looked nothing like this. But somehow, this place felt honest, like it had simply been waiting. The brass key slid into the front door lock with surprising ease. The hinges groaned as she pushed the door open. Cold air drifted through the empty rooms. Furniture remained exactly where someone had left it. A worn leather chair beside a stone fireplace. Books arranged neatly on shelves. A knitted blanket folded carefully across a sofa. A pair of reading glasses resting on a side table. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt interrupted, as though the owner had stepped outside for a walk and never returned. Rachel closed the door behind her. "I don't know whose house this really is," she whispered into the silence. "But thank you for letting me in." Her own voice sounded strange inside the quiet rooms. She spent the afternoon walking from room to room. The kitchen cupboard still held chipped coffee mugs. A calendar remained hanging on the wall. Its pages stopped 6 months earlier. The bedroom upstairs overlooked the lake. Everything had been left neatly in place. The bed was made. A quilt covered the mattress. On the nightstand sat an old alarm clock that had stopped at 2:17. Rachel reached out but didn't touch it. Some things deserved to remain exactly as they had been found. Near sunset, she discovered one room unlike the others. The smallest bedroom at the end of the hallway. The walls were painted a soft shade of blue. Dust covered everything. Yet someone had carefully preserved the room. A small bookshelf, a rocking horse, a hand-sewn quilt decorated with stars. On the closet door hung wooden letters spelling a single name. Rachel. She stopped breathing. Slowly, she pushed the door wider. Inside the closet hung tiny dresses that no longer fit anyone. A child's raincoat. A pair of worn sneakers. On the top shelf rested a stuffed bear with one missing button eye. Rachel picked it up with trembling hands. There was a small stitched patch on one paw. For Rachel. She sank onto the edge of the little bed. The room blurred through tears she had spent years refusing to shed. Someone had expected her. Not for a week. Not for a month. For years. Someone had left this room untouched, believing one day she might walk through that very door. Darkness settled quickly over Lake Willow. Rachel built a small fire in the stone fireplace using logs stacked neatly beside the hearth. As the flames crackled to life, warmth slowly spread through the room. For the first time in nearly 5 years, she slept beneath a real roof, not inside her van, not worrying about being told to move, not listening for footsteps outside her door. Just before drifting to sleep, her eyes wandered toward an old photograph resting on the mantel. The same older man, the same kind smile, the same gentle eyes. A small brass plaque beneath the frame read, Edward Holloway, 1946 to 2025. Beloved father, beloved grandfather. Rachel stared at the final word. Grandfather, she whispered it once, barely loud enough to hear herself. I wish I'd known you. Outside, the wind drifted softly across the frozen lake. The old dock creaked against the ice, almost as if it were remembering. Rachel closed her eyes, believing the hardest part of her journey was finally over. She had no way of knowing that beneath those weathered wooden boards, hidden where only time and patience could protect it, Edward Holloway had left something far more valuable than a house. He had left the truth, and by the time Rachel uncovered it, neither her life nor the quiet little town of Lake Willow would ever be the same again. Rachel woke before sunrise. For a few quiet seconds, she forgot where she was. Then she heard the gentle sound of water brushing against the old dock behind the house, followed by the faint crackling of the fire that had nearly burned itself out during the night. The house was perfectly still, not the uneasy silence she had grown accustomed to while sleeping inside her van, where every unfamiliar sound meant someone might knock on the window and tell her to move along. The silence was different. It felt peaceful. It felt like the kind of silence that belonged to old homes carrying decades of memories. She wrapped the knitted blanket more tightly around her shoulders and stepped onto the back porch. The morning air was sharp but beautiful. Lake Willow stretched before her beneath a pale winter sky, its surface almost perfectly still except for the occasional ripple drifting toward shore. Rachel found herself wondering how many mornings Edward Holloway had stood in this exact place. Had he watched the sunrise here with a cup of coffee? Had he looked across the lake and wondered where his granddaughter was? Had he truly believed she would someday find her way home? The thought lingered with her long, after she finished the last spoonful of instant coffee she had found in one of the kitchen cabinets. Before calling the attorney, whose number had been tucked inside the envelope, she decided to walk around the property. She wanted to see everything. The backyard sloped gently toward the water. Fresh snow covered most of the ground, but the old wooden dock remained exposed, its dark weathered boards still damp from years of rain, ice, and changing seasons. As Rachel stepped onto it, the dock answered with a familiar groan. Every footstep echoed softly across the quiet lake. Halfway down the dock, something caught her attention. One plank looked different from all the others. It wasn't new. It simply hadn't aged the same way. Its color was slightly darker. The grain of the wood didn't match. Someone had replaced that single board many years ago. Rachel crouched beside it, brushing away the thin layer of frost with her gloved hand. The screws fastening it in place weren't the same as the ones holding the surrounding boards. A strange feeling settled in her chest. Curiosity, almost instinct. She hurried back to the garage and searched through an old wooden workbench until she found a rusty screwdriver. It took nearly 20 minutes. The screws had almost fused to the wood after so many winters. When the final screw finally gave way, Rachel carefully lifted the board. Beneath it was a narrow opening between two heavy support beams. At first, she saw nothing. Then her eyes adjusted. A metal box had been strapped securely beneath the dock. Its surface was stained with rust, but protected from the water. Rachel reached down carefully. It was heavier than she expected. She pulled it free, scraping the cold metal against the beams until it rested in her hands. Across the lid, someone had carved two simple words by hand. For Rachel. She froze. No one could have written those words by accident. Edward had hidden this, and he had hidden it for her. Rachel carried the box back inside the house, set it gently on the kitchen table, and stared at it for several long moments before opening it. Her heart was pounding. She wasn't expecting riches. She certainly wasn't expecting miracles. Still, part of her wondered if the box might contain old jewelry, cash, or legal papers connected to the house. Instead, she found something far more valuable. Inside were bundles of letters, each tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. Every envelope had been carefully labeled. For Rachel, age 5. For Rachel, first day of school. For Rachel, Christmas. For Rachel, sweet 16. For Rachel, graduation day. For Rachel, the day you come home. Rachel reached for the smallest envelope. Her hands were trembling so badly she almost dropped it. Inside was a birthday card. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained steady. Happy birthday, sweetheart. You're 5 years old today. I don't know where you are, but I hope someone remembered to make you smile. I bought you a little teddy bear. I'll keep it here until I can give it to you myself. Love, Grandpa Edward. Rachel lowered the letter into her lap. Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. No one had ever written her a birthday card. No one had ever called her sweetheart. Not once in her entire life. She opened another letter. Then another. Then another. Every birthday. Every Christmas. Every important milestone she had never lived with a family to celebrate. Edward had written to her anyway. Some letters described the first snowfall over Lake Willow. Others talked about the loons returning each spring. Sometimes he apologized for not finding her. Sometimes he simply told her how much he hoped she was safe. But every letter ended the same way. "I'm still looking for you." Rachel pressed the letters against her chest and cried harder than she had in years. Not because she had suddenly inherited a house, but because, for the first time, she realized something she had never allowed herself to believe. She had never been forgotten. Someone had loved her every single year she thought she was completely alone. At the bottom of the box lay a small stuffed bear. One button eye was missing. A faded blue ribbon was still tied around its neck. Rachel recognized it instantly. It was the same bear waiting upstairs in the little bedroom. Edward had written about it 20 years earlier. He had truly planned to place it in her hands. Beneath the bear rested an old leather journal. Unlike the letters, its pages weren't filled with memories. They were filled with names, dates, maps, notes written in careful handwriting. Rachel opened to the first page. The early entries described Edward's search for her. Phone calls to social service offices, letters mailed across several counties, visits to agencies that no longer had records. Every failed attempt ended with the same heartbreaking sentence. "Still searching." But halfway through the journal, everything changed. The entries became shorter, more urgent. License plate numbers, boat registration numbers, sketches of the shoreline, times, dates, observations made late at night. One paragraph had been underlined twice. "They aren't just buying lake property. They're forcing people to sell. The ones who refuse are being threatened." Rachel frowned. She kept reading. The journal contained years of careful observations. Edward hadn't simply been writing memories. He had been documenting something. Watching, recording, waiting, almost as though he knew someone would one day need this information. The final page stopped Rachel cold. The handwriting was shakier now, as if age or illness had made every word more difficult to write. "If you're reading this, then I never had the chance to explain everything. If they discover you're my granddaughter, they may come looking for this house. More importantly, they'll come looking for what I found. Trust Sheriff Daniel Brooks. Trust no one else until he tells you it's safe." Rachel read those final words once, then again, a third time. Just then, she heard it. The low rumble of an engine somewhere out on the lake. She slowly lifted her eyes toward the kitchen window. Far beyond the dock, barely visible through the gray winter mist, a small fishing boat drifted silently across the water. Its running lights were off. It wasn't heading toward the middle of the lake. It was moving slowly, deliberately, toward Edward Holloway's dock. Rachel instinctively stepped away from the window. The journal remained open on the kitchen table. The letters lay scattered around it. Only a few minutes earlier, the old house had felt lonely. Now, it felt as though someone was watching it. Rachel stood motionless behind the kitchen window. The small fishing boat drifted closer before finally changing course and disappearing into the morning mist. Whoever had been aboard never came ashore. Within minutes, the lake looked peaceful again, almost as if nothing had happened. But something had changed inside Rachel. When she first arrived at Lake Willow, she believed the old house represented the end of her search. Now she understood it was only the beginning. She carefully gathered every letter and returned them to the metal box. The journal, however, remained on the kitchen table. Edward had spent years protecting it. She intended to understand why. The attorney's business card was still inside her backpack. So was the note instructing her to trust Sheriff Daniel Brooks. Rachel looked from one to the other before making her decision. The journal came first. She slipped it into her coat. Lake Willow's sheriff's office occupied a modest brick building near the center of town. The American flag outside moved gently in the winter breeze. Rachel hesitated before opening the front door. She had spent most of her life avoiding police officers. Experience had taught her they usually arrived when someone wanted her to leave. This was the first time she had ever walked into a station by choice. An elderly receptionist smiled warmly. "Can I help you? I'm looking for Sheriff Daniel Brooks." The woman studied Rachel for a moment before nodding. "I'll let him know you're here." A few minutes later, an older man stepped into the lobby. His hair had turned almost completely white, but his broad shoulders hinted at decades of hard work. His eyes settled on Rachel, then on the leather journal tucked beneath her arm. His expression changed instantly. "You must be Rachel Holloway." Rachel stopped walking. "You know who I am." He gave a slow nod. "I've been hoping you'd come." Daniel Brooks led her into his office and quietly closed the door. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the sheriff looked toward the journal. "So, Edward finally trusted you with it." Rachel gently placed it on the desk. "He wrote that I should trust you." The sheriff smiled sadly. "I told him that if he ever found you, I'd help keep that promise." Rachel leaned forward. "Did you know my grandfather well?" Daniel's eyes drifted toward an old framed photograph hanging on the wall. It showed two younger men standing beside Lake Willow decades earlier. One of them was Edward. The other was Daniel. "We grew up together," he said quietly. "We fished this lake as boys. Went to school together. Served as volunteer firefighters together. He was the closest thing I ever had to a brother." Rachel listened without interrupting. "After your parents died," Daniel continued, "Edward searched for you every single chance he had. He hired investigators. He contacted agencies. He never stopped asking questions." Rachel lowered her eyes. "He never found me." Daniel shook his head. "No, but he never stopped believing he would." Rachel carefully opened one of the birthday letters. "He wrote every year." Daniel smiled. "I know. I mailed many of them." Rachel looked up in surprise. "You did?" "He knew the addresses were outdated. He knew most would never reach you. But every birthday he walked into the post office carrying another envelope." Daniel laughed softly. "The clerk once asked him why he kept paying postage for letters that always came back." Rachel swallowed hard. "What did he say?" The sheriff looked toward the window overlooking Main Street. "He said, maybe one day the address will finally be right." Rachel felt tears filling her eyes again. For years she had believed Mondays belonged only to disappointment. Now she realized someone else had also been waiting. Every year, every birthday, every Christmas, across hundreds of miles. Daniel opened the journal. The first half tells the story of a grandfather searching for his granddaughter. He slowly turned several pages. The second half tells a different story. Rachel nodded. "I saw the names. The maps? The notes. What was he investigating?" Daniel took a deep breath. "About 15 years ago, wealthy investors started buying land around Lake Willow. Most people sold willingly, but some families refused. Then strange things began happening. Property taxes suddenly increased. Anonymous threats. Broken fences. Boats vandalized. People became frightened." Rachel listened silently. Edward noticed patterns no one else saw. He kept records. He believed someone was forcing longtime residents to leave so the shoreline could be developed. Unfortunately, Daniel paused. He was right. Rachel looked toward the journal. So why didn't he tell the police? Daniel's face tightened. He did, more than once. But there wasn't enough evidence, only suspicions. So he kept watching, documenting, waiting. Rachel thought about the boat she had seen that morning. I think someone came to the house today. Daniel's expression became serious. I was afraid that might happen. You aren't the only one who knows Edward is gone. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Rachel wrapped both hands around the warm mug of coffee Daniel had offered her. What should I do? The sheriff didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into a drawer and removed a worn envelope. Across the front, written in Edward's familiar handwriting, were 4 simple words. Give to Rachel personally. Daniel slid it across the desk. He left this with me 6 months ago. He told me not to open it, and not to give it to anyone else. Rachel stared at the envelope in disbelief. There are more. Daniel smiled gently. He never stopped preparing for the day you'd come home. Oh. Rachel opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single folded page. The handwriting was weaker than before, but unmistakably Edward's. My dearest Rachel, if Daniel has given you this letter, then you've already found the house. I hope you've also found something far more important. I hope you've found proof that you were loved every single day we were apart. You may spend years wondering why life took us down different roads. I ask myself that question every morning. Eventually, I realized something. Love isn't measured by the years we share. It's measured by whether we keep showing up, even when hope seems impossible. I've been showing up for you every birthday. Now it's your turn to show up for someone else. That is how broken families become whole again. Rachel finished reading. The room was silent. She no longer felt as though she had inherited a lonely house beside a forgotten lake. She had inherited something much greater, a purpose. For most of her life, she believed family was something you either had or lost forever. Edward had quietly spent 20 years teaching her a different truth. Family was not defined by proximity, nor by blood alone. It was defined by love that refused to disappear, even across decades of silence. As Rachel folded the letter and slipped it safely into her coat pocket, she understood that finding Lake Willow had never been the true destination. The real journey had been learning that she had never been abandoned. She had been loved all along, and for the first time in her life, she knew exactly what she wanted to do with that love. Rachel drove back to the lake house with Edward's final letter tucked safely inside her coat. The road that had felt unfamiliar only 2 days earlier now seemed strangely welcoming. Snow-covered pine trees lined both sides of the narrow highway. The frozen lake appeared between the branches every few miles, shimmering beneath the pale afternoon sun. She kept thinking about one sentence. Now it's your turn to show up for someone else. Edward hadn't asked her to protect the house. He hadn't asked her to chase criminals. He hadn't even asked her to finish his investigation. He had asked something much simpler, to become for someone else what he had tried to be for her. The realization stayed with her all the way home. As Rachel pulled into the driveway, she immediately noticed fresh tire tracks in the snow. They hadn't been there that morning. Someone had driven onto the property. Her heart skipped. She parked without turning off the engine and looked carefully around the yard. Nothing moved. The front porch was empty. The windows appeared untouched. Even so, something felt wrong. She reached for her phone. Before dialing, she remembered Sheriff Brooks' advice. If anything seems unusual, call me first. Within 20 minutes, Daniel Brooks arrived in an old sheriff's pickup. Together, they inspected the property. Nothing had been stolen. The doors remained locked. The letters were still inside the metal box. The journal was exactly where Rachel had hidden it beneath loose floorboards in the upstairs bedroom. But near the back porch, Daniel crouched beside a set of footprints. He studied them silently. They weren't trying to break in, he finally said. They were checking to see if someone had already moved in. Rachel felt a chill despite the heavy winter coat. They know someone's here. Daniel nodded. And sooner or later, they'll realize that someone is Edward's granddaughter. That evening, Rachel continued reading Edward's journal. Several pages near the back contained names she recognized from driving through town. The owner of the bait shop, a retired schoolteacher, an elderly widow who lived alone on the eastern shore. Edward had written short notes beside each name. Refused to sell. Received anonymous threats. Fence destroyed. Property taxes appealed. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Every person who resisted selling their land had eventually experienced intimidation. Rachel closed the journal and stared at the fire. Edward hadn't been chasing conspiracy theories. He had been documenting people's lives, trying to protect neighbors who often didn't even realize someone was watching out for them. It reminded her of the letters. He had quietly loved people without asking for recognition. The following morning, Rachel visited the small diner in town. She chose a booth near the window and ordered coffee. As she waited, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Nearly everyone knew everyone else. The waitress greeted customers by name. A farmer helped an elderly man carry his groceries. Two women stopped their conversation simply to wave at a little girl walking home from school. It was ordinary, simple, yet completely foreign to Rachel. She had spent years living where no one noticed whether she existed. Here, people looked each other in the eye. An older waitress approached her table. "You must be Edward's granddaughter." Rachel looked surprised. "You've heard already?" The woman smiled gently. In a town this size, news travels faster than the snow. Rachel laughed for the first time since arriving. A genuine laugh. The waitress poured more coffee. "Your grandfather came here every Thursday. He always ordered blueberry pancakes. He talked about you." Rachel blinked. "He talked about me. Every single week." The waitress leaned closer. He'd point toward the empty chair across from him and say, "One day, my granddaughter's going to sit right there." Rachel looked at the empty seat across the table. For a moment, she could almost picture Edward smiling back at her. Over the next several days, Rachel began meeting the people whose names filled Edward's journal. Mrs. Evelyn Carter invited her inside for homemade apple pie. Mr. Lewis, the bait shop owner, showed her old photographs of Edward helping children learn to fish. A retired librarian handed Rachel a box of newspaper clippings that Edward had donated over the years. Everywhere she went, people told the same story. He never gave up. He was always helping someone. He never talked badly about anyone. And every birthday. He wondered where you were. Rachel had spent years believing she entered the world alone. Now she realized she had unknowingly grown up surrounded by stories about herself. Not because people knew her. Because Edward had kept her memory alive. One snowy afternoon, Rachel wandered into the spare bedroom that Edward had prepared decades earlier. The tiny bed, the bookshelf, the rocking horse, the stuffed bear. Everything remained exactly where he had left it. She sat quietly on the edge of the bed. The room no longer made her cry. Instead, it filled her with something unexpected. Responsibility. Edward hadn't preserved this room because he refused to move on. He had preserved it because hope mattered. Hope had given him a reason to keep writing letters that might never be read. Hope had given him the strength to search year after year. Hope had built this room. Rachel looked around slowly. Then an idea came to her. It wasn't fully formed, only a small thought, but it refused to leave. There were other people like her, young people who had aged out of foster care, teenagers sleeping in cars, children who believed no one was waiting for them. She knew exactly how that felt. Perhaps this house wasn't meant to remain a museum of the past. Perhaps it was meant to become a beginning for someone else's future. She smiled through quiet tears. For the first time in her life, she wasn't wondering what she had inherited. She was wondering what she could build. As evening settled over Lake Willow, Rachel stepped onto the porch and looked toward the old mailbox standing beside the gravel driveway. For years, she had waited for someone to send her a message that she mattered. Now, she finally understood Edward's last lesson. The greatest gift wasn't receiving hope. It was becoming the person who gave it away. Winter slowly gave way to early spring. Each morning, Rachel woke to a different view outside the lake house. The snow that had covered the shoreline for months gradually disappeared. Thin sheets of ice broke apart along the edges of Lake Willow, drifting lazily across the water before melting beneath the warming sun. For the first time in years, Rachel found herself looking forward to tomorrow, not because life had suddenly become easy, but because every new day gave her another chance to understand the man she had never known. Every evening she read another of Edward's journals. Every morning she met another person whose life he had quietly touched. The more she learned about him, the more one truth became impossible to ignore. Edward never tried to become important. He simply tried to become useful. Rachel began repairing the house one room at a time. The porch railing was the first project. Then she repainted the faded front door the same warm blue Edward had once chosen. She fixed loose floorboards, replaced broken window panes, and cleaned years of dust from every bookshelf. Neighbors started appearing without being asked. Mr. Lewis brought lumber. Mrs. Carter arrived carrying homemade soup. Teenagers from the local high school volunteered on weekends to repaint the old fence. No one asked for payment. They all gave the same answer. Edward would have done the same for us. Rachel had spent years believing that asking for help was a sign of weakness. Lake Willow taught her something entirely different. Sometimes helping another person gave them just as much joy as receiving help. One afternoon, Sheriff Daniel Brooks arrived, carrying several cardboard boxes. "I found these in the courthouse basement," he said. "They belonged to Edward." Inside were dozens of old photographs. Rachel carefully sorted through them. Edward smiling beside children during a fishing derby. Edward repairing a widow's roof after a storm. Edward serving meals during the holidays. Edward planting trees with local students. In nearly every photograph, he stood slightly behind everyone else. Never at the center. Never seeking attention. Always making sure someone else was smiling. Daniel picked up one faded picture. "You know," he said quietly, "your grandfather had every reason to become bitter." Rachel looked up. "He lost his daughter. He lost you." He watched people take advantage of good families. Daniel paused. But he made a decision. What decision? That pain would never become the reason he stopped being kind. Rachel stared at the photograph for a long moment. She wondered how different her own life might have been if she had learned that lesson years earlier. The investigation into Edward's journal slowly moved forward. State investigators reviewed the evidence he had collected over nearly 15 years. Several former property owners agreed to speak publicly. Old financial records began connecting developers to acts of intimidation that had once seemed unrelated. Daniel remained cautious. "It's going to take time," he reminded Rachel. "But your grandfather gave us something we never had before." Proof. Rachel realized something surprising. Weeks earlier, she would have wanted revenge. Now, she wanted justice. There was a difference. Revenge focused on the past. Justice protected the future. Edward had understood that long before she did. One rainy afternoon, Rachel visited the town library. She wanted to learn more about the foster care system that had shaped her own childhood. The librarian showed her newspaper articles about young adults who aged out of care with nowhere to live. Some slept in shelters. Others lived in cars. Many disappeared into homelessness before their 21st birthdays. Rachel quietly closed the folder. She didn't need statistics to understand those stories. She had lived one herself. As she walked back toward the lake house, Edward's words echoed once again. Now it's your turn to show up for someone else. This time, the meaning became perfectly clear. The empty guest rooms upstairs, the large kitchen, the peaceful lake. The house wasn't too big for one person. It was too meaningful to belong to only one person. That evening, Rachel spread several sheets of paper across the dining room table. She began making lists. Repairs still needed, bedrooms that could be renovated, costs, volunteers, local charities, churches, community organizations. The idea that had first appeared as a quiet thought was slowly becoming a real plan. She wasn't simply restoring Edward's house. She was preparing it for people who still hadn't found a place to belong. Several days later, Rachel walked out to the old mailbox beside the gravel road. She opened it out of habit. Inside was a single envelope. This time it wasn't addressed to her. It was from Mrs. Carter. Inside was a handwritten note. Your grandfather once told me that every home should leave its door open for someone who has nowhere else to go. I think he'd be proud of what you're doing. If you need volunteers, my family will be there. Rachel smiled. A week later, another note appeared. Then another. One neighbor offered furniture. Another donated books. A retired carpenter volunteered to rebuild the upstairs bedrooms. A local grocery store promised monthly food deliveries. Without realizing it, the people of Lake Willow had begun building the dream alongside her. Edward's kindness had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting for someone to carry it forward. As spring settled over the lake, Rachel stood at the end of the dock where she had found the metal box only weeks before. The water reflected the evening sky like glass. She held one of Edward's birthday letters in her hands. Carefully, she folded it and returned it to its envelope. I finally understand, she whispered into the quiet breeze. You weren't trying to give me a house. You were teaching me how to build a home. The wind carried softly across the lake. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called across the water, just as it had on the day she arrived. Rachel smiled through tears. For years, she had measured her life by everything she had lost. Now she measured it by something entirely different. Every person she could help, every life she could change, every door she could open. Because Edward Holloway had spent 20 years proving that love does not end when people are separated. It simply waits until someone chooses to pass it on. The first guests arrived on a warm Saturday morning in early June. Rachel stood on the front porch of the old lake house, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching volunteers unload the final pieces of furniture. The faded white house looked different now. Fresh paint covered the weathered siding. Flower boxes lined the porch railing. The broken dock had been repaired. The spare bedroom Edward had prepared for her all those years ago remained untouched, preserved exactly as he had left it. Every other room had found a new purpose. One had become a small library. Another served as a counseling room. 3 upstairs bedrooms were ready for young adults who had nowhere else to go. Above the front door hung a simple wooden sign, The Holloway House, a place to begin again. Rachel smiled. She thought Edward would have liked that name, not because it carried his family name, but because it spoke about hope. The grand opening wasn't announced with television cameras or newspaper headlines. There were no speeches, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, only neighbors, friends, volunteers, people carrying homemade casseroles, fresh bread, blankets, boxes of books. Children ran across the lawn laughing while older residents arranged folding chairs beneath the oak tree overlooking the lake. Sheriff Daniel Brooks stood quietly beside Rachel. "You did it," he said. Rachel shook her head. "No." She looked around at the dozens of smiling faces. "We did." Daniel smiled. "Edward would probably argue with both of us." Rachel laughed. "He'd say none of this was ever about him." Daniel nodded. "Exactly." Late that afternoon, the first resident arrived. His name was Noah. He was 19 years old. He carried everything he owned inside one worn backpack. Rachel recognized the look in his eyes immediately. The exhaustion, the uncertainty, the quiet habit of expecting disappointment. He stood awkwardly near the porch steps. I was told this place helps people." Rachel smiled gently. "It does. I don't have any money. You don't need any. I can only stay a few days. You can stay as long as you need." He looked confused. "Really?" Rachel opened the front door. "Come inside." For several long seconds, Noah didn't move. It was as if he had forgotten what it felt like to be welcomed instead of questioned. Finally, he stepped across the threshold. Rachel couldn't explain why, but tears filled her eyes. Years earlier, someone had left a bedroom waiting for her. Now, she was opening one for someone else. Edward had been right. This was how broken families became whole again. Over the following months, more young people arrived. Some had aged out of foster care. Some had escaped abusive homes. Others simply had nowhere left to turn. Rachel never asked them to explain everything on the first day. She remembered how difficult trust could be. Instead, she always asked the same question. "Have you eaten?" It was a small question, but it carried a much bigger message. You're safe. You're welcome. You matter. Slowly, the house filled with laughter. Birthday celebrations. Shared dinners. Movie nights. Homework spread across the dining room table. The lonely silence that once filled every room disappeared. In its place came life. Exactly the kind of life Edward had quietly imagined all those years ago. Months later, state investigators officially announced criminal charges against several developers involved in the intimidation campaign around Lake Willow. Edward's journals became one of the most important pieces of evidence. Families who had spent years living in fear finally received justice. Reporters occasionally asked Rachel for interviews. She politely declined most of them. Whenever someone called her a hero, she smiled and shook her head. "I'm just continuing someone else's kindness." That answer appeared in nearly every newspaper article written about Holloway House. Rachel hoped it would, because it was true. One crisp autumn afternoon, Rachel walked to the old mailbox beside the gravel road. It was the same mailbox she had passed every day since moving into the house. She remembered another mailbox hundreds of miles away, the one she had checked every Monday for years, the one that had changed her life forever. She opened this mailbox expecting bills. Instead, she found a folded sheet of notebook paper. There was no envelope, only a short, handwritten note. "I heard this place helps people who don't have anyone. I'm 17. I've been sleeping in my car for 3 weeks. I'm scared. I don't know what to do." Rachel stared at the note. Her hands began to tremble. Not from fear, from recognition. She knew exactly what those words felt like. Without saying anything, she folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Then she walked back toward the front porch. The evening sun reflected across Lake Willow, painting the water with shades of gold. Inside the house, laughter drifted through the open windows. Someone was making dinner. Someone else was practicing guitar. For the first time in years, the old house no longer echoed with memories alone. It echoed with new beginnings. Rachel opened the front door. A teenage boy stood nervously at the bottom of the steps, his backpack hanging from one shoulder. He looked ready to apologize simply for being there. Rachel recognized that expression immediately. She had worn it herself once. The boy hesitated. I left the note." Rachel smiled with the same warmth Edward had imagined giving his granddaughter. She stepped aside and held the door open. "No," she said softly. "You found your way home." The boy looked at her in disbelief. Then, slowly, he stepped inside. Rachel closed the door behind him. Outside, the mailbox stood quietly beside the road. Years earlier, it had delivered a single letter that changed one lonely young woman's life. Now it had become something even more meaningful, a place where hope could begin again. And somewhere beyond the calm waters of Lake Willow, Rachel liked to believe Edward Holloway was finally at peace, not because his journey had ended, but because the love he had protected for so many years would continue reaching people he would never meet. Just as he had always hoped it would, Rachel once believed the greatest gift she would ever receive was the letter that led her to Lake Willow. Years later, she realized the letter was never the destination. It was the beginning. Edward never became famous. He never lived to see the lives his kindness would change. He simply chose, day after day, to believe that love was always worth giving, even when he had no promise it would ever be returned. That quiet choice became his greatest legacy. Rachel could have allowed her painful past to define her future. Instead, she transformed the place that had been waiting for her into a home for people who were still searching for hope. In doing so, she discovered something many of us spend a lifetime trying to learn. The deepest wounds often become the very place where we are able to heal someone else. Perhaps that's the lesson this story leaves with all of us. Life will not remember us for the size of our house, the money in our bank account, or the titles we earned. It will remember the people who felt less alone because we were here. A phone call we almost didn't make. A letter we almost didn't write. A door we chose to leave open. Small acts of kindness rarely feel extraordinary in the moment, but years later, they often become the memories someone treasures most. As evening settles over Lake Willow, the old mailbox still stands beside the quiet road. To strangers, it is only an old wooden post with a weathered metal box. But to Rachel, it is proof that one act of love can outlive a lifetime. Because somewhere, right now, there may be someone waiting for the kindness only you can give. So don't wait. Write the letter. Make the call. Open the door. One day, your greatest legacy may not be what you leave behind, but the hope you leave inside someone else's heart. And sometimes, that's enough to change a life forever.